Okay, so this is our number 1 steer. So he's obviously Black Angus or Black Beef. So does anybody notice anything about him, good or bad, off that? Yes, Noah.
He is extremely high flying. Like that is not like.
So what she's talking about is the rear flank right here. For you, those of you who are there, here last week, I talked about how kind of the lower flank, the more heavier finish they are. This guy, he's a pretty lean animal because you can see how high flank he is. That's not necessarily a good thing, so we want to write higher flank on the bad side.
Where would I write that the fact that he's black? Where could I write that, Rachel?
So, generally I write him right beside the number right here. So, I write him he's black right here. So I remember that he is the black steer in the class that we are judging. Thank you, Stephanie. Does anybody else notice anything about him too? You can use your little note sheet of the terms that I gave you. Now I'll move him to the rear view so you can see him from behind.
He is not finished at all.
So here's a rear view of the number 1 steer. So some things I would notice. Does anybody have anything?
He's really narrow. He got no butt.
I would agree. He does have no butt. So what would be a good term to use for that? Light muscle would be a good one. I wouldn't necessarily really say he's narrow. He does have a decent base. Maybe not as wide as we want, but should I put light muscle?
He's near the top.
Yes, I would agree with that.
How can you tell? I can't see his top.
Okay, so right here are your pins are right here, and he's not good at reasons, guys. I'm sorry. So when you're looking at him from the rear view, you can kind of see how he slopes up really quick at the very top right here. So he doesn't necessarily have as much back muscle as some of the other ones that we'll see later on. Let's see if I can pull up another view. Skipped it.
Now I can see
Here's
his
a
top.
top view of our number 1 steer. Did you say something? No. Tiger, sorry. Okay. So I kind of talked a little bit earlier about like the spring of rib and how you can kind of see their ribs fit out. Well, normally right here, so here's his shoulders, obviously. Sorry if I'm blocking it for you guys. And normally they kind of come out because you want that spring of the rib because it's more body volume, more body capacity. He's kind of lacking in that department, I definitely say. So, yeah. Tiger rib. Is there anything good about him that you guys would say?
He's not balanced.
I know we talked about a little bit earlier about the higher flank, and that means that he doesn't have necessarily the most finish. And the less finish we have, more of the higher cutability a steer is gonna have because, you know, you don't wanna cut off a whole bunch of fat. So I would say that he is definitely a higher cutability steer.
What's cutability mean, Rachel?
Cutability is kind of a meats judging term that's thrown into livestock. When they're hanging up on the rail, you gotta trim off all the excess fat because you don't wanna eat that as, I don't wanna eat fat, I don't know about you guys. So, higher cutability means that you're gonna have to trim off less fat on the rail. Lower cutability is, you have to trim off more. And since he doesn't necessarily have a lot of finish, as Noah pointed out, he is a higher cutability steer. I'm trying to find him on the wall. Okay, there we go.
He's fighting.
You want him to be able to move around really easily. So, one good indicator is if they have good structure is when he steps off, his back leg should be in the same place that his front leg is. You don't want him to overstep. You don't want to really kind of understep that, because that might be an indicator of some structural problems. So, now that I said that, let's watch them walk. Does anybody have any comments on what he walked like? That's not necessarily what we're looking for Colt in, but I definitely think he's understrided just a tad. He didn't quite match that front hoof print with his rear. So what might be an underlying cause of that? Okay, so if you look up here when he's walking, see how his top line is like really moving around up there?
He's not free walking either, like, he's kind of like resisting the halter a little bit.
That is true, that might also be a problem. I would definitely say that he's probably a weaker top line steer, especially on the move, kind of breaks right here, because you want him to have that strong top line.
You sure that would be necessarily weak topped?
I don't know.
Weak tops when they bow.
Okay.
So I would say that this steer is tight in his hips, specifically tight in his hooks, because he doesn't reach out with his back leg and really make that free, agile stride. So I'd say he's tight in his hip, because that's really his big nail on the head problem.
So let's move on to number 2. Hopefully we'll get it. Does anybody know what breed this is? Charlotte, good job. Okay.
So
I
let's.
would definitely write down that it is a Charlotte. Charlotte appearance. You don't technically know his breed.
I think he's a white shorthorn.
So, what do you guys notice about number 2?
Like short body.
Yes, I would agree with that. When you look at he is clean fronted. Okay, so he is a shorter bodied steer, definitely. Alright, however, as Captain pointed out, he is clean fronted. So if you look up here, you see there's his dewlap and there's his brisket, and they're pretty clean. They don't really have a lot of fat. They aren't really wasty. So clean fronted.
Height them a little bit. I think the arch in his back kind of helps to equalize the quarters.
I wouldn't say he's necessarily as higher, his high flank as number one was definitely.
Not.
So I would agree with you there. But however, if you look up here at his tail head, we'll get a better view. You can kind of see those fat deposits right there. So he is a finished steer, definitely.
He's a lot better than number one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
So if you guys can look really close, you'll actually see there's like some lines right here. That's his muscle definition. So he isn't necessarily too fat. He is finished though, I would say.
He's a better back.
He does have a wider back than the number one here. Because there's his pins right here. So he is significantly wider. And if you look up here, you can kind of see the beginnings of the tennis balls that I talked about last week, where his fat deposits there when you have a finished steer. So I would say he's heavily muscular. Would you guys agree?
I don't think he's a very good reason to start with. I just broke out decently muscled.
Okay. So he is big footed right here. He's decently wide, I'd say. He doesn't really have any structural problems with his legs from this angle. So that's always a bonus. Here's a better example of what I was talking about earlier, a boulder sprung rib, because there's his ribs right there and they come out a bit more. Does anybody else have any other terms that they think this steer is on the top view? Especially here, you can kind of see his muscles when he's walking around.
He's jiggly.
Yes, he is jiggly. He's also more finished than number one was, definitely. Are you guys satisfied for what we have for two? Okay. So what would you use for an identifier?